Since the advent of solvers, the game of poker changed forever. Now, most serious players, from nosebleeds all the way down to the micro stakes, incorporate at least some solver work into their study, and this has resulted in massive strategic advancements in the last few years. In a way, you could think of each poker player as a single iteration in a giant sim, where we are all collectively moving towards the equilibrium. However, we aren't quite there yet, and we will in fact never get there. There is no human capable of playing a perfect GTO strategy, which means that even the best players in the world are exploitable, some more so than others. One way a quote-unquote GTO player can be exploited is by doing a deep analysis of their frequencies in different branches of the game tree and identifying areas where they're imbalanced. Another less common approach, which is the topic of this video, is by deliberately forcing the game off tree, that is, intentionally deviating from GTO strategies to bring your opponent into territories that haven't been well studied. Since many people learn GTO through repetitive drilling and memorization, when you move the game off tree, it can potentially confuse your opponent, where if they fail to make the appropriate adjustments, it will result in mistakes. This is similar to a tactic used by the world's greatest chess player, Magnus Carlsen.
Now I feel like the playing field is a lot more level. There are both computer engines, neural networks, and hybrid engines available to practically anybody. So it's much harder to find ideas now that that actually like give you an advantage with the white pieces. I mean, people don't expect to find those ideas anymore. Now it's all about finding ideas that are missed by the engines. Either they're missed entirely or they're missed at low depth, and using them to, gain some advantage in the sense that you have more knowledge. And it's also good to know that usually these are not complete bluffs, these are like semi-bluffs, so that you know that even if your opponent makes all the right moves, you can still make a draw. Short answer is, these days it's all about surprising your opponent and taking it into position where you have more knowledge.
So is there some sense in which it's okay to make suboptimal quote-unquote moves?
No, but you have to. I mean, you have to, because the best moves have been analyzed to death mostly.
So that's a kind of, when you say semi-bluff, that's a kind of sacrifice. You're sacrificing the optimal move, the optimal position, so that you can take the opponent. I mean, that's a game theoretic sense. Yeah. You take the opponent into something they didn't prepare well.
Yeah.
In this video, we will show 3 examples of some of the best players in the world taking the game off tree, and consider how this sort of strategy may be constructed in a rational way. In this first hand, we have Mooney's star playing Stefan heads up. Mooney's opens the button, Stefan defends. Mooney's bets half pot on flop, and Stefan calls. The turn is the queen of hearts, and Mooney's bets 3/4 pot, and Stefan calls again. The river is the king of diamonds, and Stefan donks out with a 3rd pot bet. So up until the river, the actions taken by both players were in line with GTO. However, this river donk by Stefan is simply not a thing. Mooney's was the pre-flop aggressor, and he barreled on both the flop and turn, and this river card isn't better for Stefan's range. At this point, Mooney's range should be much stronger, particularly at the top, and so the big blind, being out of position, should in theory just check range. He has a lower probability of holding the strongest hand, which in turn means that his bluffs will not be as effective. And even if he is actually holding a very strong hand, like the nut flush, checking is the highest EV play, because the button with the nut advantage should be very likely to bet, which he can then raise. Now, it's unclear why Stefan made this move. Perhaps he knows of a possible leak in Mooney's game. What we do know is that Stefan has established himself as a very creative and unorthodox player that puts his opponents in difficult spots with non-standard plays just like this. And you can imagine how this type of off-tree move could throw your opponent for a loop, not perhaps someone of the caliber of Mooney's star, but many other lesser opponents, especially if they rely on pure rote memorization of GTO solutions. Even though checking is the highest EV play for 100% of the combos in Stefan's range, similar to Magnus's tactic, you may be able to make up this EV in future nodes if your opponent becomes lost by an off-tree move. So how might one go about constructing a rational off-tree strategy such as this? I think we have to assume that this isn't just a random spaz out. There's likely some method to the madness, and that method is likely based on some principles of EV maximization. Recall what Magnus said. He referred to his off-tree plays as semi-bluffs, which still allow him to play to a draw if the opponent responds perfectly. In other words, we don't want to go off tree by just doing random bullshit, because if you do that, there's nothing to differentiate you from a 10NL mouth breather. Instead, we can still avail the game theory to constrain our deviations. So first of all, we won't want to make an off tree play that loses mass EV compared to GTO, right? We aren't calling a 200 big blind shove with just jack high because we don't think our opponent has shit. We still should be applying the principles and mechanics of EV maximization that we discussed in these videos, which means that even though our frequencies may be off, we aren't just punting chips left and right. Secondly, unless we are exploiting a specific weakness of our opponent, our off-tree strategy, whatever it may look like, should be somewhat balanced with combos of various equity profiles present in different branches of our game tree. So what could this sort of EV maximizing off-tree strategy look like in this specific scenario? Forget about the action up until this point. How is a small, out-of-position bet like this usually constructed? Well, generally the primary driver of this type of strategy is to expand the betting range to allow a greater proportion of value combos to be called by worse, which in the alternative may face a larger bet if the out-of-position player checks instead. And in order to balance this bet, the same sizing will also be used by much stronger hands and some bluffs. In short, the out-of-position block bet is usually made with a merged range where hands of different equity classes all play the same way. And given that Stefan is at a nut disadvantage, a small bet makes the most sense. In this case, one of the most prominent regions of villain's range is likely Queen X that c-bet on the flop and then barrel the turn after hitting top pair. And this is a hand that would likely check back river, along with some other marginal hands like underpairs that had a flush or straight draw on the turn. So in that light, at a minimum, a well-constructed donk betting range would likely include some King X hands plus, which can obtain value from this prominent region of the button's range, and also can benefit from setting a lower price relative to what Moonies would likely bet in position after check 2 with stronger combos such as 2 pairs and some bluffs. And we see that if we isolate all top pairs, 2 pairs and straights, the EV regret is 5.9%, which means that out of all of the combos in this bucket, the maximum EV loss for donk betting third pot in this situation against the static GTO strategy is around 1.5 big blinds, which isn't ideal but not a huge punt. On the other hand, if we isolate the lower pairs, we see that the EV regret shoots up to over 15%, which is significant. These hands are highly incentivized to check because the likelihood of getting called by worse on this flushed and straighty board is relatively low. And as for bluffs, you could probably throw in some air or lower pairs with 1 heart to perhaps fold out some of the second and lower pairs in the button's range. So now that we've created a reasonable donk betting range for Stefan, the next question is, if someone takes you off tree like this, how should you respond? Well, since we can't just rely on mindlessly replicating a sim, again, we should look to EV maximizing principles. If we assume that the bottom of the big blind's value betting range is around King X, that means Munis should defend all King X plus and then some weaker hands as bluff catchers. And exploitatively, it would probably make sense to leverage the nut advantage and increase the raising frequency both in terms of value and bluffs to really punish the middle part of Stefan's range for betting instead of just realizing equity, perhaps by emphasizing combos with an ace, jack, or 9 and a heart, depending on where we think Stefan's bluffs are coming from and what his donk fold range looks like. In this next hand, Nacho opens on the button, Linus 3-bets from the small blind and Nacho calls. Linus bets small on the flop and Nacho calls. The turn is the deuce of hearts and Linus sizes up to nearly full pot and Nacho calls again. The river is the 6 of diamonds, Linus checks, and Nacho makes a small bet, which Linus calls. Nacho then shows king queen and Linus mucks. So again, up to the river, the action was consistent with the solver overall. However, Nacho's small bet is not. Generally speaking, a small bet in position on the river is not super typical because a small bet is usually most appropriate for medium strength hands, but on the river, this class will often have a high incentive to just check back and fully realize instead of reopening the action. The solver does bet Nacho's hand, but it prefers the shove. With Linus betting the flop and potting it on the turn, his range had become relatively polarized, and the 6th river is more or less a blank. This means that Linus should have triple barreled with most of his strong hands, which in turn means that after checking, his range should be significantly capped and mostly behind Nacho's strong top pair. So why did Nacho bet small here? Again, it's impossible to know for sure, but perhaps this is an exploitative move designed to expand Linus's bluff catching range, or perhaps he thinks he can induce Linus to bluff raise with trash, or maybe he thought king-queen was just too thin to shove. In any event, this is not a solver-approved move, so the next question is, how might one construct this type of small betting range in a rational way? Well, ideally, it would be constructed based on how we think Linus is specifically playing, but in a vacuum, from the EV maximization standpoint, as we discussed in the last hand, we know that a smaller bet means that we can expand our value betting range and play in a more merged manner. So in this case, although the solver is shoving king-queen, that appears to be the general cutoff for its value bets. So with the smaller bet, Nacho could probably include all of his queen-x combos. And we see that the EV regret for betting all the hands in this bucket 30% is just 0.8% of the pot. As mentioned, this bet should induce someone who's elastic to bet sizing, which Linus certainly is, to expand his bluff catching range, perhaps to include hands like ace-king and ace-10, and to also expand his bluff raising range, which Nacho I think would be happy to call off with holding king-queen. In our final hand, we have Nacho raising on the button and Stefan calling in the big blind. The flop is ace, deuce, jack, 2 diamonds. Nacho makes a small bet, which Stefan calls. The turn is the queen of diamonds. Nacho bets half pot, and then Stefan goes nuts, raising it 7.5x, and Nacho calls. The river is the 5 of hearts. Stefan shoves, and Nacho calls and takes down the pot, flush over flush. So the end result of the players getting it all in, around 100 big blinds deep, button versus big blind in a single raise pot, with both players having a flush, isn't too surprising. But Stefan's huge turn raise is not used by the solver essentially at all. Perhaps Stefan simply wanted to raise to an amount that would leave a pot-sized bet behind on the river, with a hand he felt was strong enough to play for stacks, and perhaps he wanted to accelerate things on the turn and take the initiative because Nacho should have had plenty of strong hands to call with, including top pairs, 2 pairs, sets, straights, and flush draws, that may not have been willing to call off stacks on the river, facing an overbet depending on the runout. And we do see that if we isolate the 10 high flushes, the EV regret for raising 7.5x is just 0.2% of the pot. Also, the EV regret for raising this amount remains low for most jack high, 9 high, and 8 high flushes. King high flushes, which probably block much of Nacho's calling range, and the lower flushes, which may be dominated, lose more in EV in this line. Now, generally, the solver avoids taking actions that cause its range to narrow dramatically like this, but against most humans, it probably won't result in major vulnerabilities. By this huge raise, Stefan is basically saying that I have a flush, and probably a strong one, or a bluff. And while flushes only constitute around 8% of his range, as long as he balances his play with sufficient bluffs to induce calls, he will still be very difficult to play against. Essentially, this type of hyperpolarizing off-tree play is similar to what we've seen Michael Adamo do time and time again to great effect. And this move, as well as all of the off-tree plays we've analyzed in this video, were potentially plus EV and close in EV to the highest EV play. It's just that the combos that have the strongest incentive to take these sorts of off-tree actions only represented a small fraction of the range. In other words, essentially these off-tree moves force a significant pruning of the game tree. Against a solver, this type of strategy can be exploited with node locking, but as long as this play is done in a balanced, well-constructed manner, most humans won't be able to precisely counter this type of play, which has the upside of potentially mitigating the advantages the opponent may have if he is more well-studied with simulations.